My name is Mike. I'm a professor for social work management, and you are listening to Managing Around, the bi-weekly podcast about social science, culture, and management. Managing Around is part of the Talk About Organizations podcast network, a community resource and discussion platform for key ideas in management and organization studies, which is supported by our listeners. Recently, I came across a very short, reasonably cheap, and fairly interesting book on Solidarity by Heinz Bude. I found the book during preparations for my social policy lectures at the uni, and I was shocked how little I could remember and contribute to this topic, which is of paramount importance in our society. It is so obvious, most of us would agree that all societies need to be built on this principle. But actually, how solidary behavior, a community of solidarity, is and who joint liability in our society bears, has become much clearer to me. And this is part 2 of our series on the discussion of the book Solidarity, the Future of a Great Idea, written by the well-known German sociologist Heinz Bude, who currently teaches as a professor for Macrosociology at the University of Kassel. In the last episode, we've thoroughly discussed about the free rider problem, solidarity as the social bond in our society, which provides a sense of community. And in today's episode, we will conclude our discussion with a journey to the functions of the welfare state, the difference between solidarity and empathy, and we will conclude with an outlook to the question of what the book tells us about the current situation and our common future. And this is the first topic for today: the apparatus of the social and the longing for society. In a way, the welfare state could be understood as institutionalized solidarity. In the welfare state, we take care of our fellow human beings and their needs for so-called standard risks in the society. For example, retirement, unemployment, or an incapacity for work. It actually are not the taxes which help us to reduce poverty and expand the coverage of social security, but at least in Germany, it is the community of all the paying contributors to the social insurances that finance the welfare state. Solidarity is thus understood as the precaution and privilege of every citizen, and not only workers, to participate in the collective good, what we call social security. With other words, we act out of solidarity. It is the solidarity of a common community that another world has to gain. Over the years, the welfare state has grown to an administrative state that identifies supply problems, organizes equivalent measures, and calculates maintenance costs, which regularly arouses suspicion and inspires the critics who see it as a weakness to be dependent on a state supply. Although we cannot be sure that it will pay off when it comes to retirement, there is still no major generational conflict. And while we are talking about generational perspectives, this brings us back to history. Not the source of war, but the future is our second part for today. In the book, Bude explains changes within the German society in the post-war period, when people were forced to rebuild a society through solidarity. As one result, a welfare state was created in which individuals feel safe and sound, and which has taken on another task: the allocation of justified claims by individual groups. The war experiences have been a resource for the creation of the German society that we can experience today. In this context, Bude makes a strong point, and I quote from the book, page 88, "The solidarity resource of German society should no longer be the result from coping with the past, but rather from gaining the future. End of quote. However, today, the idea of solidarity is gaining support in various parts of Europe and not only in Germany. But let us come back to the concept of solidarity for a moment, which brings us to our third part, the difference between empathy and solidarity. A great thinker of the idea of solidarity was and still is Emmanuel Levinas, who wrote that the beginning of all solidarity is the so-called, and I quote from the book, page 115, overpowering of the absoluteness of the other, who comes to me in his need and nakedness, in his hunger for help, without my being deaf to this call. End of quote. Let us expand a little bit on that idea. Levinas says, I see the others in need and cannot help but come to their aid, because otherwise I would betray myself in my own humanity. And at this point, we have to differentiate between empathy and solidarity. While empathy can be understood as the possibility of putting yourself in someone else's position, it does not mean that you would provide a helping hand in each situation and show solidarity. Empathy brings us closer to the other. Solidarity, however, brings us together with others, says Bude. Real empathy is only perceived and stimulates action when people know each other well. With other words, in order to help others and show empathy, a sense of togetherness will be necessary. There is no empathy without solidarity, and vice versa. Solidarity does not rise by itself or by contrast. But, first of all, the question would be who we are and what we want to be as a society and community. With other words, there is no ethically neutral position with the concept of solidarity. And this brings us to the fourth part of today's episode, the different perspectives of justice. Bude says in the book, which is from location 1582 in the ebook, the state must allow justice to prevail. Civil society can afford solidarity. The rule of justice states that the social order may only provide for preferential positions if this is to the advantage of the less privileged. Based on this principle, it is justified that the state supports financially disadvantaged citizens regardless of sex, origin, age, religion, etc. And I quote from the book again, location 1600 from the ebook. The state even goes so far that it guarantees my negative freedom, which means to turn myself against the state with unreasonable demands, even if it supposedly serves the common good. End of quote. However, equality between all people and the protection of individual needs are fundamental in order to enable everyone to have a happy life. This equal treatment of all individuals is ethically linked to the principle of reciprocity. In the 20th century alone, there were enough examples of such solidarity and joint movements in which a feeling of unity arises in people. Against this backdrop, Bude redefines solidarity as follows, and I quote from the book, location 1728 from the ebook: not ethically neutral, but also not morally pretentious, unifying individuals but not binding them collectively together. The word can be used depending on the situation, but not shaping society as a whole. End of quote. With other words, solidarity is a fluid and a plastic, non-tangible objective in a society. Additionally, solidarity has to cope with different challenges in the society. And this brings us to part 5, solidarity in a world of inequality. Bude assesses the current and past development of global affairs as follows. We are witnessing a global development that puts the global north into a defensive position and the global south on the offensive. There are countries in which many things are improving, but there are also other countries where the living conditions are getting worse and worse. In addition, Bude points his finger to the globally growing gap between the rich and the poor, which is also an important factor that divides a society. And I quote from the book, location 1793 in the ebook. So even though the cake is getting bigger overall, there are a lot of people who get a smaller piece of it. End of quote. The differentiating factor for this standard of living is no longer the class, but the place where you live. In connection with solidarity, Bude poses the question of what is worth living for. Finally, he explains that solidarity can only be valued if one has once been lonely. And I add another quote from the end of the book, from location 1915 in the ebook. Solidarity can neither be morally enforced through arguments nor recommended as a therapy for a wounded self. Solidarity is often meaningless for the whole and expensive for one's own. Nevertheless, I support any solidarity because I consent to the absurdity of my existence and at the same time rebel against it. The solidarians are not kidding themselves. They come together to prove that we can continue together and that I don't have to give up. The essential sentence on this matter is, you can only measure the gain of solidarity if you know loneliness. End of quote. We are nearly at the end of this episode, and now it's time to draw some conclusions. I found it fascinating to have read the book, which was published in 2019, in the current COVID-19 crisis. A question came to my mind: why is there such a high approval of the governmental actions and regulation in almost all societies? This is somehow related to the fact that we cannot deal with the challenges as individuals alone. The challenges are bigger than us. On the one hand, those states which have a strong welfare state weathered the crisis very well. Additionally, those societies were the more successful in which individuals must not be afraid of the authority of the state, especially when there is a fraction of people who deny the regulations. What can be learned from the book in these difficult times, and what will persist in the next 10 years is, I think, this. It becomes more and more apparent that tendencies such as deglobalization and glocalization, with a K in the middle, will gain new strength. One of the great lessons to be learned, in my view, will be to redefine the governmental actions and the position of the social welfare state in the future. Maybe we will also have to talk about a postmodern conception of statehood. Solidarity would certainly be at its core. If you want to learn more and don't fear to read German, a helpful reference to this topic is the book Bude Heinz, 2019, Solidarität, die Zukunft einer, großen Idee, from Munich, Hanser Publishing. Alright, that's it for today, dear listeners. I truly appreciate all your efforts to tune in my podcast for this episode. Please, if you liked this episode, don't forget subscribing to the podcast channel in your favorite podcast app, so you can stay up to date whenever a brand new episode of Managing Around is released. Stay safe, and we will see us on the next episode. Thank you for listening. Managing Around, the bi-weekly podcast about social science, culture, and management. Managing Around is part of the Talk About Organizations podcast network, a community resource and discussion platform for key ideas in management and organization studies, which is supported by our listeners. If you liked this episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast website. There's also a link in the show notes. If you've got any thoughts on this episode, or if you've got any idea about new podcast topics or questions you'd like to discuss, send me an audio file or voice note to hi@profmanagement.de. For any non-audio comments, drop a tweet or DM to @profmanagement on Twitter or Instagram, please. For more information, visit my website www.profmanagement.de. Thank you for listening and see you next time.